Good morning, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I know we are about 25, no, 65 participants at the moment. I'm going to quickly introduce this webinar series. The webinar of today is the third one of the webinar series on coastal resilience, organized by the DCCCR, the Decade Collaborative Center for Coastal Resilience, and the CMCC, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. Today's webinar is actually the first one where we have a third partners, which is Deltares. Since both Deltares and CMCC are partners from recently to our DCC. I introduce myself. My name is Cecilia, and I am the project manager of the program manager of the DCC-CR. Today's and here you can see the partnership, which is called Alliance of the DCCCR, Deltares, and the CMCC. You can follow us if you subscribe to our newsletters, scanning this QR code, which I can give it to you even at the end of the seminar. Just a brief introduction about the DCC, the Decade Collaborative Center, is part of the United Nations Decade, and we focus on one of the main challenges, one of the challenges of the decade, which is increase community resilience to ocean and coastal risks. And we try to achieve one of the decade outcome, which is a safe ocean. Today's webinar is held by Professor Ana Queirós of the Marine and Climate Change, is a Marine and Climate Change Ecologist at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Ana is has over 10-year experience, and she's experienced in climate change modeling applications and transdisciplinary decision support tool to help policymaker and end user make evidence-based decisions for sustainable and ocean management. Anna's focus is research on marine spatial planning and marine protected areas, fisheries, and blue carbon habitats. Anna has a lot of collaboration, and she that you can read here, and she's also a DCCCR in part of our international advisory board. Is a member of our International Advisory Board. Just a brief description on how the seminar is going to work. Anna's webinar will last about 30 to 40 minutes. After that, we will leave about 10 minutes for questions that should be sent through our Q&A session, Q&A Zoom box in the Zoom. Also, we'd like to inform you that this webinar is recorded. So I think I can now, just a second. Oh, this is just to let you know that we're going to have another webinar on the 1st of February. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now and leave the floor to Ana.
Thank you, Cecilia. I will try to share my screen, and hopefully that works for everyone. Could I just have a yes or no that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Thank you, Cecilia. Yes. So, hi everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Anna, I'm a principal investigator here at Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK, and I'm an honorary professor at the University of Exeter. And I'm going to be sharing some experiences from the research community and from practitioners on marine spatial planning, and particularly on the development of climate action through planning as an opportunity for nature and people. So first of all, just a clear scoping of what we are actually talking about today. There's lots of concepts around there related to planning, and we will be talking specifically about marine spatial planning. So you might have heard about similar concepts like area-based management, integrated coastal zone management, and more recently, sustainable ocean planning. But we will be talking about marine spatial planning in particular. And so what is climate smart marine spatial planning? Well, climate smart marine spatial planning takes a lot of the elements of MSP, hopefully all of them, so MSP marine spatial planning, which has the ambition to document and set goals about how we use marine space, so marine activities in the ocean, in space and time. It has the purpose of meeting ecologic, economic, and social goals governed by, of course, an overarching political process. This is very clear to us, especially today. And it helps us deliver ecosystem-based management. So it has this broad view of the marine environment and all of our activities in it, including nature as one of the sectors. So it's a policy instrument that is multi-sectoral and multi-objective. When we talk about climate smart MSP, what we talk is about all of those goals. And in addition, the ambition to promote climate change adaptation, so the response to climate change impacts, as well as mitigation, so the curbing of the speed of climate change or net zero. And related to this, we have, of course, a big drive to expand the use of renewable energy, to use carbon capture approaches, but also adaptive approaches to coastal protection, marine conservation, and resource management. So if we don't do climate smart MSP, what do we actually stand to lose? Well, actually quite a lot. So we risk the non-delivery of our MSP objectives, unsustainable human activities because of this lack of consideration for the additional effects of climate change. And this in turn might lead to ineffective nature protection, impacts on natural resources, which might lead to loss of marine livelihoods, particularly in coastal areas, which are very connected to the ocean. We might see impacts on infrastructure, impacts on people and nature protection measures. We will indeed slow the pace of decarbonization because the ocean presents this, strong regulation of the global climate system, and so a continued breakdown of our system if we don't consider this. And this in turn might lead to a loss of trust and lowered support for planning actions, and the exacerbation of cross-sectorial conflicts in that competition for the use of marine space. The flip side of that is, of course, that if we do climate smart marine planning, we might see a resilient delivery of MSP objectives into the future, more sustainable human activities. We might be able to future-proof nature protection and in this way enable sustainable development. We might see therefore more resilience for nature and for people. We'll be able to accelerate decarbonization, improve climate regulation, but importantly, improve that trust and social license for planning, without which planning cannot take place. And it will have hopefully, better sectorial management and reduced conflict in the use of space. And so in the recent future, we are happy to see that actually there's quite a few examples of climate action being delivered through MSP around the world. So for example, all across Europe, in the Seychelles, so in the Western Indian Ocean, in the United States. And a lot of these measures tend to focus primarily on adapting to the immediate effects of climate change on the coastal environment, so things like sea level rise and dealing with coastal erosion. There's a big push in these measures in terms of mitigation as well, particularly the growth of the renewable sector, which in Europe is particularly strong. But what we are seeing less of is this more sort of concerted view of MSP as a process to deliver, to drive climate action, both thinking about adaptation and mitigation. And there's particularly a lack of measures that are emerging, particularly related to adaptation more holistically when we think about the coast and the marine environment. And so, for example, examples of mitigation, well, the Irish National Marine Planning Framework is a really good example where we have the first climate policy in the plan is specifically about minimizing and enhancing areas providing carbon sequestration. So it takes this broad view of the Irish continental shelf and where are those, those big stores of carbon, and with a view to minimize impact on those. So recognizing the role of the ocean in regulating our climate. In terms of adaptation, we have, for example, the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan in the Western Indian Ocean, which really looks at limiting activities in areas less affected by ocean warming. And these areas are in turn protected by biodiversity. So there is a zoning element, a spatial prescription of activities within the plan policy that is driven by the response of the environment to, particularly to ocean warming. So a good example of adaptation for nature and for people. And so when we talk about marine spatial planning, we're often talking about a cycle where there is a drafting, a review of the plan, an implementation, and then a review. And this process can take 5, 10 years, 20 years. So in different areas of the world, we have different lengths of cycles. And this cycle, what we hope for when we talk about climate smart MSP is that we want to make sure that that cycle is well connected with the wider climate change policy, for example, adaptation plans. We want it to consider climate change evidence at all stages of the cycle. We would like it to have very specific climate objectives included in the plans. And hopefully the implementation and monitoring phases also include indicators to track the effectiveness of those policies in terms of delivering climate objectives. So hopefully what we aspire to when we talk about climate smart MSP is an MSP process that leads to and is driven by climate action. Now, in reality, what that means in terms of the practical steps of the MSP cycle is about embedding climate change in all of those where possible. So it's about ensuring that the vision and the objectives of the plan, for example, are climate smart, that the evidence gathering phases, including climate evidence that's being analyzed, that the draft plan includes climate-specific policies and that they are adopted and implemented, and that we have that monitoring ability to check that those objectives are actually being met so that changes can be made in the next phase of the cycle. And what we talked about in a group I'm going to tell you a little bit about through the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas workshop on climate change considerations in marine spatial planning is speaking to researchers and practitioners in this area to try and understand what are the enablers of that process. So what do we see in the real lived experiences of practitioners and researchers that work in this area in terms of what has helped deliver this, or where is it helping to deliver this as a vision to deliver climate action through planning? And so that workshop took place about 18 months ago online. And as I said, it was coordinated through the ICES working group on marine planning and coastal zone management. And the workshop results are already available online if you'd like to have a summary view of that, and you can follow that QR code. And it had about 50 participants on the day from around 20 nations. So it was a really good spread of views from around the world. And in addition to that, what we did was we spent the next year having these writing sessions where we're trying to create some idea of what is best practice around climate smart MSP, but with a view not just of aspiration, but what is actually working, what is happening on the ground. And that's what I'll talk to you about today. So the workshop was structured very much about understanding, how does climate change affect planning per se, and then what are examples of adaptation and mitigation that we're seeing around the world, again, not in terms of aspiration, but actually in terms of implementation, and how can planning also contribute to wider goals on marine planning, and what do we think about that? And so what we did find was that there are these 4 pillars that emerge that facilitate that delivery of climate smart planning and climate smart plans, the plan being the policy that results from the planning process, and that they revolve around evidence, communication, resources, and governance, and that best practices around this seem to be establishing themselves through the community, despite the fact that planning is a very context-specific process to each nation and region. And so we'll start with the first one, which is about the evidence, which is the one that I am more familiar with. So in this case, what we see is that there are often underrepresented groups in the planning process, frequently local communities, indigenous peoples, but that these people actually hold a lot of the ancestral and traditional knowledge about marine systems that can help with climate smart planning delivery. And so, for instance, wrong button, apologies. up and
Probably take your time.
so share, hopefully. There's always a technical something. And so what we're finding is that, for example, this work we've done in Tanzania showed through participatory mapping that communities in the Zanzibar archipelago were very sensitive and aware of climate change-driven alteration of their habitats, which are often linked to coastal livelihoods, and that some of those perceptions were very clearly linked to what we were seeing with climate change modeling. So what we saw was that communities can see the change and can often see the change before we can document it through scientific evidence. So that's important to planning, that we recognize that knowledge. And what we're seeing in the practice is actually a recognition of this type of traditional knowledge about the ocean being used in the development of plans. For example, in the development of the Marine Spatial Plan for Canada's Northern Shelf bioregion, which includes particular measures related to climate change mitigation. So a pairing of Indigenous knowledge and Western science to develop this plan. So these are two good examples that I recommend if you're interested in this subject. And so the point I was trying to make is that is this perception about what is evidence that is needed for climate smart MSP. And when we speak to practitioners and researchers separately, and this is something that we did through the workshop, was that they don't always line up. And that has been seen by some in the community as sort of delaying progress that we see in the delivery of climate smart plans. And so particular differences around research gaps, the data that practitioners need to implement, to get social license for climate action. But where they come together is this understanding that they do need some view of the impacts of climate change on the marine environment, some ability to forecast, to look into the future, into possible alternative futures to help them make these sort of no regrets decisions. And so what we've seen historically is that there's no lack of climate modeling evidence for the ocean, certainly not at the global and the regional level. What we see is that that data is not always well suited to the MSP process. And so particularly when we see climate adaptation, for example, used in zoning plans, they often still focus only on warming. But we know that organisms in the ocean, so our living resources, our biodiversity, experience climate change in a much more multifaceted way. So it's about warming, it's about acidification, the oxygenation, changes in extreme weather event patterns, changes in ocean circulation. And so it's multiple patterns of change which have different degrees of impact at the regional level and at the local level that plans operate in. And that's difficult to act on. And these affect not only the species we want to protect, but also those that we want to exploit. And so there are important consequences in terms of the effectiveness of our spatial management mechanisms when we don't take these changes into account. And so what we see traditionally is that, climate evidence might say, temperature goes up by X degrees by the end of the century, or pH goes down through acidification by X much, or this species will decrease and this species will increase. But what practitioners we want to know is, how much of that does it actually matter? How does it affect my planning area? And what can I do to protect particularly economic development, particularly in coastal areas? So it's that mismatch between the data that is available and how it can be usable in planning. So modeling analysis traditionally do not necessarily form useful products for stakeholder consultations that are inherent to planning, with planning being a very consultatory or consultation-heavy process. And so it's that mismatch that's been problematic. The complexity of the evidence as well, there's multiple variables having different patterns of change, different species, different habitats, can be difficult to deal with at the planning level when we have, in effect, an agency with statutory responsibility to deliver, to design that plan, and that can be difficult. And so more tailored approaches are needed to increase that ocean literacy of the planning process, the ocean climate literacy of the planning process, but also to promote that buy-in, that social license that is necessary to deliver climate action through planning. And so several decision support tools are emerging in the literature, tailored and oftentimes co-developed with planners. And so I think what's become a bit of an example in the community is the Symphony tool, which was developed by Swedish policymakers and that has this view, at least some view of climate change within the pressures that are experienced in the marine environment. And so there's this generation of cumulative pressures that take into account all sorts of activities like shipping, fisheries, and so on. And then they add at least some representation of exposure of these species and habitats to climate change, which is not the same as the response of these species and habitats to climate change, but it's one tool that is brought in climate change alongside human pressures in the marine environment to get this view that there's more than what we do directly through our activities that affects these habitats, and to inform the planning process through that. So there's a lot of in it to read about. If you're interested, just follow the link. Now, in the UK, we've also been looking at this, and in this case, we have as an example of co-delivery between research and policy. So we co-wrote this project called MSpace that I lead, and you'll be hearing about this a little bit through the presentation, which is about filling in these data gaps and capability gaps in the UK policy communities. And so this specific decision support tool creates these data products that are sector specific. So they identify climate change refugia, but in this case, for specific sectors of interest to planning. And those data products are then being fed into planning processes and into the specific decision support tools that policymakers use in the UK, rather than a separate tool per se. And this takes into account human impacts as well as climate change. And so in this case, the data product is based on ocean climate modeling, but specific for different sectors of interest. And then we use climate signal detection analysis, which we don't need to talk about. But in essence, it provides a classification of the UK waters into 3 types of areas. So the hotspots, the very sensitive areas, the refugia, the areas that are resilient, and the bright spots where conditions improve. And these are really the opportunities to have resilience, to have growth in these sectors that can be encouraged through planning. And so this information allows us to build these sector-specific climate resilience maps, and these in turn are then overlaid with the GIS data referring to the planning area. And from this, we can create a second data product, which allows for that relationship between climate and human activities. And it's through this that we are then co-developing solutions and deploying that climate-smart MSP with various agencies around the UK that might allow the UK communities to make these types of no-regrets decisions. And so the data products look a little bit like this. What you can see is that if you look, for example, at pelagic fisheries and for example, at benthic aquaculture, you're not going to have those refugia in the same area. So it's these sector-specific refugia that are particularly useful to planners. Okay, so that's the climate evidence. So part of that is about, the delay has been on the mismatch between the data and the process, but part of that is also about skepticism. That delay has to do with skepticism around climate evidence, uncertainty in climate projections, which is really inherent to climate change modeling. And so the work we've been doing in this case and in others is to improve the transparency of the quality of those projections in replicating what we're seeing in real life. In this case, it's an example from the MSpace project as well, where we have dedicated assessment of the uncertainty, the modeling data that we use in the assessment that is then sort of condensed into sort of easy to understand visuals for end users. And this is informed in particular, this is why I wanted to bring this up, by the process done by the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership, which is one of the partners of the project, which has this responsibility in England to create communication between the research community and the marine policy community to create co-creation of projects and ensuring that the data is flowing correctly at the science policy interface. And if you want to learn more about their own lessons in terms of communicating climate change evidence within that interface, I recommend that you have a look at this paper led by Matt Frost. Okay, so communication, right? So what we've seen as well is that what's facilitating climate smart MSP delivery are these projects where you have an active collaboration, you have co-design, and that is helping to build relationships of trust through planning. A good example of that is the Orkney Islands Marine Planning Advisory Group, or OMPAG. So the Orkney Islands being a region in the northeast of the UK that have their own regional MSP process. And what they have is this OMPAG group that provides expert advice and guidance to the Orkney Islands Council, which is the agency that has the statutory responsibility to develop MSP. And within which climate change is a policy objective. And so what we see is that the OMPAC actually provides a really important step to communicate what the planning process with a multiple stakeholder group, which includes academia, economic development, recreation, so tourism, all sorts, oil and gas, fisheries, all sorts. And it's the representation of that group, which covers the main sectors affected by the plan and allows for that direct communication as the process, the planning takes place. So it's that communication that we find to be facilitating the delivery of climate smart MSP, because it creates an alignment of objectives across the community, which in turn creates buy-in for the planning process, which might include, as in this case, a climate change policy objective. And I'm very pleased to say that we are also working with them on the development of the climate smart objectives of that process. Another element of this, as I said, is around communication. What we found in that workshop is that it's important that the climate change evidence is accessible. And that doesn't mean just creating visuals that are easy to understand. It's also about translating that climate change evidence, which is often natural sciences evidence, into metrics that people can relate to, and that particularly end users and stakeholders of the planning process, such as industrial representatives, that makes those impacts and that the potential benefits of climate action more tangible. And so, for example, in a way that, through consultation, we are able to create support for zoning processes, which might not immediately have, an intuitive benefit, for example, for industry, particularly, those linked to conservation objectives in plans. And so what we see is that planners and industry often want to know, how does it affect them? How can I protect jobs in my sector? And so what we need is, for example, this type of approach, input-output modeling, which allows the translation of those zoning scenarios and what that represents in terms of changes to marine uses into economic indicators that are more tangible, such as the number of jobs in particular sectors or in the adjacent blue economy associated with that planning area, or even greenhouse gas emissions. And it's this type of translation of the natural sciences evidence into these types of metrics that really helps steer that communication. And what we see, for example, just as an example, you can see here different scenarios are contrasted. In this case, a baseline scenario where we don't take into account the future effects of climate change in the region. And what you can see here, for example, in terms of gross value added of all of the sectors in this planning area, is that once you take into account the future changes due to climate change, there's quite a substantial change in the gross value added of all the sectors in the region. And actually introducing measures to deliver biodiversity conservation have next to no additional effect. And so it's this type of translation that makes clear that in this case, additional climate objectives that protect biodiversity in the face of climate change actually have no economic impact on the associated blue economy. So it's this type of narrative that might help create also particularly stakeholder support for climate action, particularly when we talk to industry. And so it's these types of analysis help us meet important data gaps, both from the research side, in this case, about how to communicate that evidence, as well as in terms of what practitioners want to know about, which is about changes in human activities and what measures can they make that still drive economic development, that minimize economic impacts whilst creating climate action. So it's about that alignment of objectives between the climate objectives and other objectives delivered in the plan. Okay, so that's about communication. And a lot of that also comes through co-design, as I was saying, explaining around particularly the MSpace project as an example. And so what emerged from the workshop, from the IC's workshop, was also that it is situations where we have co-design of policy and research. So where you have a very well-connected science policy interface, where we're seeing that climate smart MSP moving forward, and particularly through the development of the decision support tools. And in this case, for example, because we have a project that is co-developed and co-delivered between research and the policy agencies, the agencies with statutory responsibility to deliver plans, is that the evidence created in the project is well suited to the MSP process, particularly the climate evidence, and that is also then, and that means that that evidence is already being used in the review of current plans. And because of that, we have also advised government on new strategic direction for MSP and climate change in the UK through the Marine Spatial Prioritization Programme. And because planning cuts across, the legislative and governative landscape of the marine environment, what we see is that because of that, the data has been taken up in additional policy mechanisms through the UK. And that's something important to recognize, is that when you have climate action through planning, because planning cuts across that governance structure for the marine environment, you're likely to have benefits and accelerate climate action in other policies as well. And of course, none of that can be delivered without capacity and resources, which is the other pillar that emerged as facilitating, as enabling climate smart MSP, particularly around the development of the correct technical skills, institutional knowledge to deliver those climate smart plans and visions, but also around more mundane elements of planning. So for example, when we talk about going from a planning cycle to a climate smart planning cycle, there's lots of steps that are additionally required. There's new evidence to consider. There's new policies that need to be linked up with, which means additional consultation with stakeholders. Maybe you have to fund additional monitoring strategies. All of that requires resources. And so what we're seeing is that it's particularly funding those later stages of the cycle that has been particularly challenging. But there are good examples. And so, for example, if we look again at the Seychelles climate smart, the Seychelles MSP, and particularly the planning policy, you will read that there's a dedicated financing mechanism to deliver the planning process and the plan, which includes particularly climate change adaptation. So it's an interesting one to look at, because climate change adaptation is really at the fore of the vision of the plan. And so it is likely that these types of mechanisms, which in this case have to do with debt conversion, are likely useful to other nations in a similar economic context. And there are, so to say that there are important strategies already out there that we can capitalize upon to deliver climate smart MSP. Sorry, I'm not sure if you're seeing my teams popping up. And so so that's about funding the whole planning process. But in some cases, it's about more basic things like having dedicated staff to review the climate change evidence and to be able to process the climate change evidence, so having the correct skill set. And so another example in this case from the UK is that in many cases, the agencies with that responsibility to write the plans, to deliver the plans, often include a dedicated climate change officer. So in this case, Sean McGuinness at the MMO, who we've been working with, which is ensuring the climate smart delivery of the second generation, so of the review of the MSP or the marine plan for the east of England. And so, of course, hiring staff and maintaining staff through the MSP cycle requires long-term vision, and it requires investment over that cycle, which, as I said, can be 5, 10 years, 20 years. So it requires a lot of support from a supportive governance landscape. And so what we see emerging is that, that is a fundamental pillar to the ability to deliver climate smart MSP. What we're seeing as hindrances are cases where the plans are not actually well connected to the broader landscape to deliver those climate objectives. So, for example, if you just take a bird's eye view of what planning involves, and this is taken from the IOC and DG Mare guide for MSP, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, there's a huge variety of sectors and activities covered through planning. We need to know about cumulative effects in fisheries and aquaculture and climate change and natural capital and services. And, thinking about all of the legislative and governance structure that underpins that is actually quite complex. But what we see often, where even when we have cases where we have aspirations to deliver climate smart planning, is that, well, there is a lot of focus at the beginning in identifying the evidence and creating the objectives in the plans, but that ambition falls short when you look at the later stages in the planning, which are about implementing and about seeing whether those policies are actually working. And so what happens is that when it in terms of the delivery of climate change objectives through MSP is that the MSP is actually only advisory. It doesn't have those teeth to deliver. It doesn't have the policy strength to actually implement. And so that plans need to be harmonized with the broader governance structure and legislative structure, but they don't actually in themselves deliver that change, which can be problematic. And so to be able to do that, we need to ensure that there is that connection between planning and plans with the broader marine policy landscape, particularly for climate change, but also for resources, for nature, for investment. And that requires long-term political will. So if you like, if you were going to have that, for example, through the design and review of marine plans in England, we would have, this two-way road between planning, and which in this case the plans are regional, and the national adaptation program, the siting of marine protected areas, the net zero delivery, fisheries management plans, all sorts of climate change risk assessment. But in many cases, what we have is a direction where those sectoral policies are delivered more or less independently of the plans, and then the plans have to be harmonized with them. But what we see in the community is that it's that bidirectional link between the plan and planning and this broader landscape, particularly related to climate policy, that would enable plans to have that legislative force, that legislative teeth to deliver climate action more strongly. So that's hopefully what we aspire to as a community. And just, trying to close this off, MSP is done within our national jurisdictions, is done at the regional level and the local level. But climate action is, of course, a much broader process. And what we're seeing now is this emergence of alignment between international alignment between MSP as a process to deliver on those broader targets, particularly around climate change. And a good example of that is the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative, which was launched in 2023, and which connects the countries bordering the North Sea, which is quite a few of them, towards this recognition of the need to align MSP as hopefully a regulator, or at least a strategic advisor to our blue economy, to how we manage nature, to deliver these broader targets. So there's a focus on alignment, data sharing, knowledge sharing between all of the relevant sectors to achieve that optimal use of that limited space, which is the North Sea basin in this case, but which includes also, delivering on climate action. So this is a really good example if you're interested in that international collaboration for climate action through planning, and that link gives you more information about that. And just to close off the presentation, of course, because this could be this could be a conversation in itself. What about the areas beyond national jurisdiction? In the High Seas Treaty, which has just come, is being implemented now, or hopefully will be ratified. Is that 60% of the ocean? What about that? And without going into a lot in this area, because it's in itself, quite a rich area of conversation. There is a lot that we can offer from the national perspectives, from the regional perspectives, about collaboration, about sharing of resources that could be useful in these areas beyond national jurisdictions, and that hopefully, new initiatives coming in through, the UN Ocean Decade and others, and at the regional level, through the regional conventions, will hopefully provide that impetus to make sure that that knowledge is also being used in the BBNJ. So I'll leave it at that. That was quite a lot of information in a short amount of time. I just quickly would like to thank my co-authors of this ICES workshop on climate change considerations in MSP, which was coordinated through the ICES Working Group on Marine Planning and Coastal Zone Management, particularly our chairs, Katrina and Talia, and now Kira. And if you have any, please join us. It's a really nice group of researchers and practitioners. And I hope that was interesting. So look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana, for the very insightful presentation. You gave us a lot of information, and I can now pose you the questions that came through our Q&A Zoom session. Okay, so the first question is from Mohammed Hamran. I read it. Says marine planning is a tool to solve environmental problems and requires a financial amount. For developing countries, including Yemen, which face challenges from transport ships and foreign military activities at sea, do we start planning to solve the problem or focus on the cause and source of the problem, the marine environment?
Thank you, Mohammed, for the question. That's a really complex question. I'm not sure I'm really qualified to answer. What is important there, I think, is that, is that national and regional context, which in Yemen is so striking, right, because of these humanitarian challenges. And what it highlights as well is the difficult role of planners, which have to balance all of these different priorities in the delivery of plans. Obviously, climate change is this sort of overwhelming pressure on our marine environment that affects food security, coastal resilience, livelihoods, particularly in the developing world, where there's a real strong connection between food security and the ocean in coastal areas and cultural value associated with that. So I can't pretend that I'm qualified to know what the answer would be in Yemen, but what I think is important is that, is that recognition of the need to balance out those needs, which is the role of planners. So I have a lot of empathy for my colleagues that actually are involved in the planning process and designing these plans. And I think that's a clear example. Sorry, Mohammed, that I don't have the answers for you. Sorry.
Yeah, yes, I can see that Mohammed raised his hand, but we suggest Mohammed, if you can write in the Q&A box, then we can put you in touch with Anna for a deeper, maybe discussion about this topic. This to allow me to answer questions from other member of the audience. The next question is from Gloria Mozzi. She thank you for the presentation, and she says that you mentioned modeling techniques to translate climate change impacts into tangible metrics, which is very helpful. However, these approaches often introduce additional layer of uncertainty. How do you effectively communicate these uncertainties to stakeholders? Additionally, in some of our projects, we encounter challenges with regions and municipalities struggling to work with or fully grasp scenarios. Do you have any strategies or insights to address these issues?
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. Yeah, the two really important questions, which are really, I think, go to the heart of the challenge of climate smart MSPs. On the one side, the communication of uncertainty, which is extremely important. And this is something I can speak from a personal perspective because I've seen this happen. We have the best possible scientific tools. We've done all the work, we've done the background legwork. We bring this product to the end user and they're immediately skeptical. They need to understand, they're worried about the uncertainty in them. They want to know how much they can trust. There's often this perception that we are predicting the future, which we are not. So also understanding, what is scenario uncertainty. All of that, I think, requires dedicated engagement, which goes down to resources, right? So it's about, ultimately, resources are about staff time, about having that one-to-one connection, that ability to communicate evidence. We can work, in the best visuals possible, and some of the decision support tools I mentioned today are focused on that, on simplifying the visual elements so that people can actually understand what the evidence is, and what the uncertainty is, particularly with the modeling. But then there's often also the case that you need that dedicated time to improve literacy around these issues, to explain, to understand. So I think personally, how we work is we tend to ensure that engagement time is available, and that we can, and that often builds on previous relationships of trust, that end users actually want to come and spend that time with us. I work with colleagues in areas that tell us that simply industry doesn't want to talk to them. They don't trust scientists, and they don't want to hear it, and they don't want to know about it. Partnerships like the one I highlighted in Orkney, where people feel that they have a free, a safe space where they can come and express their views, and their views are taken into consideration in policy development, tend to be spaces where people are also more open to explore uncertainty, to help us understand their needs, so that we can, make that evidence more fitting to that process. So that's what I can offer you. The second part, can Cecilia remind me what was the second part of the question?
The second question is, she was saying in some projects, in some of their projects, they encountered challenges with regions and municipalities
Yes.
struggling to work with or to grasp the different scenarios, and if you have any
Yes.
strategies regarding those problems.
Yes. So I guess that's what I was also, that was also part of the answer, was that, yeah, it's that having that, that space where people feel that they will be heard also creates a space to improve literacy, to explain, um to understand what types of products will best fit or will have the best chances of landing positively with an end user that we require license from to deliver that action. So a lot of our work is actually not about talking, it's about listening. It's about spending time with communities, with industries, to understand what are their immediate needs. There was an interesting planners forum, which was supported by a research project in the Baltic region, which was particularly around that. It was about this sharing of what are the most pressing needs in a particular planning area. And I think it's those types of spaces that are really conducive to, on the one hand, exploring the evidence and creating evidence products that are suitable to the planning process, but also in developing those relationships of trust, which are necessary to create that will to deliver climate action.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. I'm going to pass on to the third question. It is from Alice Samuel Thomas. In the UK, have you encountered any issues with areas that are split by national borders? He refers to the Solway Fifth Estuary and the Seventh Estuary that are split both on land and by sea by national borders, which is a
That's
very
right.
specific UK question, but I think since it's
Yes, that's
appropriate
right. So
questions to
planning
you.
is yes, so planning is especially complicated in the UK because we have four nations actually working together, right? And so each nation has its own, well, planning is a devolved responsibility, which means that it's implemented at the national level and the subnational level regionally. And so there is that challenge that in some areas, particularly around the coast, we have these boundaries, and in some cases we don't even have a clear boundary, particularly in the border, between Northern Ireland, so one of the UK nations, and then Ireland, which is a European country, right, where we're not quite sure where the border actually is located, because there's not a full agreement on that. So these issues, these situations create particular challenge to the delivery of these of planning in general, but also of climate smart marine planning processes. And so what I'm seeing personally, again, I'm not a practitioner, I'm a researcher, but what I'm seeing is these partnerships, these collaborations, where those communities are coming together to work on challenges together. So particularly around, the Celtic Sea, the Irish Sea is one of them, where you have, Wales, Northern Ireland, Ireland, collaborating there. And so there are those examples, and I think those are good examples of collaboration which we can learn from in an international context. More broadly, when we think about the Greater North Sea basin as well. The ocean is, we put these lines across the ocean, right? But that's not how resources move. It's not how climate change takes place, and so we do need those dedicated initiatives to cope with that transboundary alignment.
So facilitating a cooperation between among different countries to face the same problems, and to try to apply the same policies. So the communication among countries is very, very important. So I'm going to go to the next question. It's from Desiree Schindelhammer. To which extent do social considerations, equity rights, for example, as equity rights, factor into climate smart MSP? Are there ways to highlight climate-related vulnerabilities of marginalized groups in coastal communities? For example, small-scale fishers, women, youth, and leverage this visibility for just outcomes of marine coastal planning and governance?
Yes, thank you, Desiree. That's a really good question. This is something that's really coming to the fore in the context of sustainable ocean planning, which is a slightly different thing, which is looking at broader, not just MSP, but other spatial management mechanisms. And we do indeed agree. I agree with you that there is a history of non-inclusion of these groups in the participatory process that is planning. There is documented evidence of this because, the way that, even though plans are consultative, they often have this iterative phase where a draft plan is put up for consultation. It means that you have access to the technology, that you are aware of the process. There's a certain protocol about responding to a consultation that is not necessarily inclusive of those groups. And so we have, vulnerable parts of coastal communities, but also indigenous people that are historically have not been well considered in that process. There's multiple parts to your question. So that's one aspect of it. And there are initiatives that are looking particular at this. And I think the work that indigenous peoples are doing, for example, in Canada, is particularly interesting, where you have, the peoples developing plans, management plans for their region to which they are ancestral custodians. And I think that's, particularly interesting. There is also this push to include more social evidence in the planning process, so related to climate change, so not just about the climate evidence of the impact of climate change in resources and biodiversity and how do we deal with that, coastal erosion, sea level rise, but actually how different groups are affected and what their perceptions are of that process, what their needs are. So there is a push to include more of that data, more of the social science evidence. It is not, I can't say that that's happening fast enough everywhere, but there's certainly an awareness, a growing awareness of it. And I can speak from the UK side that there is a growing interest in this, in the application of these techniques to improve that inclusivity of MSP. So yeah, so we are seeing it, but perhaps not fast enough.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for your answer. I'm going to the next question. What will, from Urias Taylor, what will it take to have any underdeveloped countries carry out MSP? Where could they start from?
Yes, thank you for that. So I think the IOC UNESCO program, MSP Global, is a great starting point. So this is exactly what they have been really focusing on, is that capability development. And if you're not aware of MSP Global, just Google that term and you will find, and there is guidance, and they do all sorts of training. There's an academy, Teachers Academy, I think it's called, which is an online resource to train people, to train practitioners in the process of MSP. There is multiple resources there in terms of development, but ultimately, oftentimes it comes down to governance and finance, doesn't it? And I think this is why I raised the Seychelles example, where it's a very interesting mechanism where national debt conversion and the private entity collaborate to deliver the finance necessary to deliver that plan. So I think there are interesting options out there, but I think the first port of call is perhaps to go and speak to the guys at IOC UNESCO. This is exactly what they are interested in, is developing capability.
Trying to copy the link on the chat if we can, otherwise it's going to be easy for everybody to check to Google. Next question is from Firas Marsit. Firas Marsit. Are there currently MSP initiatives in the frame of the development of seawater desalination in the Mediterranean region?
I'm afraid
Desalinization.
that's not really my my
Right.
area of expertise. Sorry, I'm not sure I can really help with that one.
Next question is from Ashini Otta. How can have evidence be interpreted sensibly? The questions relates to the time scale of variation and the long-term climatic impact trend. It is very likely that the community sees a positive evidence on a short time scale, while the underlying impact may be negative on a long term.
Could you repeat that, Cecilia? Sorry, I was trying to answer the previous question.
Yes. I think she is asking, how can you interpret evidence since some evidence, it's very likely that the community may have a positive evidence on a short time scale, but it may be actually be a long negative
Okay.
impact on a long term.
Yes, I understand. Thank you. I think that question goes down to the heart of what evidence is relevant and what evidence we should use to inform the planning process, right? And I think you know, if the principle of MSP is that it's evidence-based, right? That's one of the principles. And so the idea being that you are informing the planning process with the correct evidence. Now, in some cases, the evidence is imperfect or even missing, right? And we still need to deliver planning. And so what the other principle also is that planning is a cyclic process that you know, and this is especially important in the ocean, which is a highly dynamic environment, and particularly in the context of climate change, where our evidence is improving, you know, continuously. And so what you hope to have is that planning is a cycle where you provide the best evidence possible in that cycle to inform the draft plan. That you design a plan around that, which have policies to respond to climate change. And that if that evidence improves, for example, if you have a longer term period of observation and you find that the conclusion, the interpretation of the evidence has changed, you have the opportunity to update your plan. And so, for example, in some areas, what we are having already is a review of the plans and an update of that evidence. So if planning is done as expected, it's a cycle, and you have that opportunity to iterate what evidence is used and how you use that to guide the planning process.
Yes, thank you for the thorough answer, Anna. We actually have quite a few questions still, but the time, we're running out of time. Annalisa wrote our DCCCR mail in the chat. I hope everybody can see it. And we are more than welcome to receive your questions through this email and forward it to Anna or help Anna to answer those questions to get back to you, because I'm very sorry I had to cut some of your very, very interesting questions. So I think that we can close the webinar. Thank you again. Just 1 second. Yes. Okay. Yes, Annalisa is suggesting me to tell you that the recording will be available on our DCCCR website as well as on the CMCC website. Again, please do send your questions. And thank you again, Anna, for your wonderful presentation and your time to share your research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity, and nice to chat to everyone.
Goodbye.